Thank you. So we are extremely excited to have our panelists with us here today as we discuss LGBTQ plus needs in Lincoln County. Before I introduce them though, if you have been to a few of these, the ones that I moderate, every once in a while, I like to take you to school a little bit, give a little bit of some context in the beginning. A few times I've given some data and some statistics, but this time around, we're going to do things a little bit differently. And we're going to take a moment to get a little bit personal. So this topic today, LGBTQ plus needs in Lincoln County, is something that some of you might have an idea what you would say are needs, what are gaps, what are resources available. Some of you might have an idea why that's important, some of you might not. So I'm excited to be able to have this conversation today and to kind of bring us all up to speed on why this topic is important. So in 2011, sometime in 2011, I was sitting in the empty chapel of a Salvation Army, not here, but the one where I grew up, and two women who I didn't know were in front and behind me while I sat in a folding chair. My friends had paid for these women to provide a service to me, which in my charismatic fundamentalist church, we call inner healing. I didn't know fully what was going to be happening. I knew that we were going to be kind of talking about my life, talking about issues in my life, whatever. I was excited. I thought it was going to be a great experience, very impactful. And I was pretty experienced within the church. As I mentioned, I grew up in a very charismatic fundamentalist church, which was born out of the Pentecostal Church of God. And if you're not familiar, the charismatic movement is very often, if you think of, you see people praying in tongues, and it's very, there's a lot of, I think, very beautiful experiences that I had, but everything is very linked to something being a spiritual cause, and whether or not that's how you believe is fine. But when I say spiritual, I mean specifically demonic. So you can probably guess where this is going. As the night progressed and the situation progressed, the conversation shifted from talking about my childhood, talking about the people in my childhood, the memories that I had growing up, the first time I felt afraid, the first time that someone was angry at me, all of these types of things, which really, who knows the first time you were afraid or the first time someone raised their voice at you? I don't know. So, I'm making answers up, whatever I can think. So the next thing that I know, there's a woman on the floor in front of me and a woman standing behind me with her hands on my shoulders, and I immediately knew what was happening. And in that moment, I welcomed it because I had spent the entirety of my life. At this point, I was 22 or 23. And I had spent the entirety of my life trying to erase a critical part of who I was, and that I had absolutely no control over changing a core aspect of my being. I grew up being extremely active in this church, and it was a large church. Sanctuary held 1,200 people. We had 2 services on Sundays, service on Wednesday. Typically I spent 12 hours there on Thursdays because those were our choir days, and I was the pianist and backup worship leader. And I led worship on my own a lot. So I was really well known in the church, very present in the church. So I knew where this was going. And, in my mind, like I said, it was welcome because it was a step toward what I thought I wanted to be. Afterward, my friends were like, you walk different, you look different, you sound different, you interacted with my daughter differently. They were confirming what I wanted to hear, which at the time I thought was great. But quickly, when I realized that this hadn't done anything other than contribute even further to the trauma that I now live with every day, that landslide was probably the worst part of it. the height of feeling like, oh, finally, this has happened. Finally, I'm not gay. Finally, I can be who I'm supposed to be. Finally, I can be redeemed. And then that free fall into the realization that that hadn't happened. I can forgive the shouting and the yelling and the tongues and the prophesying and all of that, because, you know, those women didn't really understand what they were doing. They thought that they were doing me a service. But to think that this was paid for, first of all, paid for, second, by my friends, that part's difficult to deal with. Now you have to understand that this was built upon a couple of years of me actively trying not to be gay. A lifetime of that, but a couple of years of very, very active participation in what was called the ex-gay movement. So when that didn't work, I signed up for something called Equitas International, which was a very prominent ex-gay organization, which many times was found to not work even for the leaders who claimed to be ex-gay themselves, but then were quite often caught still being very gay. You catch my drift? So a friend of mine who went to a different church, but similar, the pastor there had been the assistant pastor at my church. We, through this process, had found out we had this in common. So we were working toward this goal together of not being gay. And so he and I signed up for Equitas International together. His church paid for the workbooks because there's a huge like textbook that comes along with it in a workbook. I had to hide these workbooks from my parents. I still lived at my parents. I hid any involvement that I had with any of this from them. Any books that I had, I was, you know, really, really making an effort to understand the situation from a theological perspective, but from every side of the conversation that I could find literature on. So as you can imagine, Equitas International was pretty horrible. And I went through the workbooks, went to one meeting, but didn't really stick around with that very much. In this time also, I went through what we call reparative therapy, which is conversion therapy. There are terms within the church for everything to make it seem gentler than what it is. We don't say I went through an exorcism, I had a deliverance. You know, the delivery was trauma though. So I went through reparative therapy by one of the assistant pastors of the church, who was not a licensed or credentialed therapist, who did not even have a college degree, who later confessed to me that he was also gay himself, or had been gay himself, but was miraculously delivered from that. And that it was my responsibility not to tell anyone what I was dealing with, because he said I needed to guard my testimony because the enemy would use it against me. So, you know, if anybody knew I was gay, Satan was going to take that and weaponize it and do even further harm. So all of these experiences were built on a lifetime of homophobic jokes, slurs, anything you can imagine, verbal violence, sometimes physical, in my family, from those closest to me who were supposed to be safe, friends at school, anybody. So you can imagine that was kind of the motivating factor of not having to deal with this anymore. So that's kind of just scratching the surface of some of those experiences that I had. And finally, throughout that year, 2011, I dedicated that year to kind of figuring out for myself, where am I going to land? What do I believe? What do I feel? My personal belief system has shifted greatly since that time. I think that was a springboard really for me to throw away what I what I had been told, what I learned, what I thought I knew, and start to explore myself, my spirituality, my thoughts on the world, on universe, on others, on community, and really build from the ground up. And the benefit there is that I can tell you exactly why I think and believe every single thing that I do, because I personally explored it for myself. So ultimately, it was a gift. I would not be the same person that I am today if I had not had those experiences. And trust me, they continued. That's not just a singular story there, but I just want to put into context briefly why this conversation is important. It's very important for me personally, but broadly in the community, my story unfortunately is not unique. And the things that I endured, while it's difficult for some people to imagine, is mild compared to what some other people experience. So if you think that it's not still happening, I'm sorry to tell you that it is. Even just in recent years, I had the opportunity to attend a board meeting where it was a school board meeting, and they were discussing how a book that children were reading had two dads, and the outrage of the parents at such a thing. We had Facebook comments about this event, talking about how this was a gross misuse of United Way funds to have this event. So, which, by the way, these events don't really cost us anything. Just, So no funds misused this time. So I just want to provide some context there to say, this is an important conversation because for many, many people still today in 2024, and increasingly, unfortunately, in 2024, this is a life or death conversation. Fortunately for me, when it got to the point of life or death, it ended up coming out as life. But so many people aren't that lucky. So with that, I want to turn it over to our panelists because we have a lot to get through, and I really hope that we can kind of have some engaging discussion today rather than just us talking at you. We do have slips of paper on the tables if you would like to write a question, but there will be moments as well when I'm going to just ask for your open input. We have several people here in the room who are members of the community who can also provide input on their experiences, opinions, and so this time around we're going to be a little bit different, and I'm going to actually open some questions up to you all as well. So with that, I would like to introduce our panelists. We have Reverend Alissia Thompson. Alicia's pronouns are she, her, and she is the pastor of United Church of Granville. She holds an MDiv from the University of Chicago and a BA in psychology from Miami University. She's also currently pursuing a doctorate in ministry at Fordham University, focusing on Christian spirituality and psychology. So welcome, Alissia. We have Breann Smith, LSW, who is with Equitas Health, and Breann's pronouns are she, her. What's your title, Breann? I'm trying to find it. She's the medical case manager. And so she does work with folks here in Lincoln County. And finally, Max Grogan, PhD. Max's pronouns are they, them. Max is the Associate Director of the Center for Belonging and Inclusion at Denison University, leading initiatives in inclusion, diversity, equity, and anti-racism. So thank you. Welcome, Max. Welcome, Breann. Welcome, Alissia. Let's give them a round of applause. All right, so our panelists have been provided a list of prepared questions, so we're going to go ahead and ask those. So each of our panelists works with the local LGBTQ+ community in different ways. If you could, panelists, please briefly explain how you interact with the local LGBTQ+ community, whether that's in your personal or professional life. And we can just start, if you want to start and go down the line.
Let's see if this, it is. First of all, good morning, everyone. So grateful that you chose to spend the morning having this conversation with us. I'm mindful that you could be anywhere else. So thank you for being here. So I'm the pastor of the United Church of Granville. We are an open and affirming congregation. Translation, that means that we welcome and embrace everyone, regardless of gender, sexual orientation, race, you name it. Everyone truly is welcome in our space. So I found that in my particular context, the way that I've interfaced with people in the LGBTQ plus community, thank you. Two ways. First of all, I am a member of the community. I am married, I have a wife. So this is a lived reality for me. Secondly, our church, God bless, has been a haven for many folks who are members of this community. It has become a place where people can feel safe and authentic and be who they are while exploring some of their religious trauma. Because quite frankly, many, if not all of us, have it. So I'm proud of that work. I'm proud of being a part of that work and this community that allows people to have the space to be who they are fully while asking some really difficult questions and oftentimes working through some really difficult historical experiences.
Hi, my name is Breann Smith. I work with Equitas Health. First, I want to just thank you for your vulnerability and sharing your stories because I think it's very important. Because not everyone does survive that, and so to be such a good role model for those to like see that life can get better is so important for all of us to share those stories. So I really appreciate you sharing that. So I work at Equitas Health. We are a very queer organization. So I work with lots of trans folks. Any letter, I work with them basically. And I myself am also part of the community, and it's been such a blessing because I would not have had the knowledge base. Like when I started over 7 years ago, I'm a completely different person in terms of how I think about gender and sexuality. I also work with those living with HIV. So many of them are in LGBTQIA. They're all are also straight people that have HIV though. So make sure you're getting tested if you need to. So yeah, I get to work with lots of folks. I cover everywhere from Columbus all the way over to Belmont County. So vast experience between how it works for the community in rural areas versus urban areas and the different resources that are available. But yeah, that's my story.
Thanks everyone for joining us, and thank you, Corey. So I work at Denison University in our Center for Belonging and Inclusion, where I lead our gender and sexuality initiatives. So much of the work that I do involves working with students, with young adults, and I'll be able to share a bit of that perspective of those needs today. In my personal life, I'm also a member of the LGBTQ community. Specifically, I'm queer and non-binary. I think that oftentimes when we talk about LGBTQ issues, there can feel like a sort of barrier to entry because there is so much vocabulary circulating around queer communities. And that vocabulary is changing so rapidly. So terms that were acceptable 5 years ago are now considered pejorative. And so when allies are seeking to enter these conversations, it can be really scary, right? Because you want to enter, you want to show support, but you're like, oh my gosh, am I going to use the wrong term and say something incorrectly? So today I will seek to define some of the terms that I'm using. And if I use a term and you don't know the definition, please feel free to raise your hand and call that out. But so for me personally, I identify as queer, which means that I don't identify with normative sexuality, where we think of dominant or normative sexuality as the idea of a man and a woman who are in a relationship, become married, have kids, white, picket fence, yada, yada, yada. So for me, queer means being outside of those sort of ideas. I also identify as non-binary, which means I don't identify as either a man or a woman, which for me is on the trans spectrum. So I would say trans non-binary. And so I think I would also encourage folks to not be scared of having conversations around LGBTQ communities. If that vocabulary question is something that comes up for you, I always encourage folks that we never want perfectionism to be a barrier to having the conversation in the first place. So having that effort, seeking to engage in conversations is such an important first step. So thank you all for being here.
All right, thank you panelists for your responses. So we touched a little bit on this. You might have touched a little bit on this in your answers to the first question. But what types of services, whether they're medical, social, psychological, or otherwise, does your organization provide to the local community? And by community, I mean specifically the queer community. And what service gaps do we currently have that you'd like to see be addressed?
So most of our services that we have at Denison are very student focused. So we provide medical services, counseling services, holistic support services, but they're primarily for Denison students. So I won't go into detail about all of those services, but a particular gap that students have pointed out is that we are often within our particular silos in the places that we are. So there are a large number of LGBTQ Denison students, but they don't necessarily feel connected with the larger community in Granville or within Licking County overall. So I think a particular gap in services is making those connections. So there are so many different orgs that provide services. There are so many opportunities to connect and have a larger sense of community, but it's hard to sort of cultivate those. So that's something that the students are interested in working on cultivating. So if you'd like to be involved in that sort of process, feel free to reach out. But I think just making those sort of connections is something that we'd love to do to fill a gap in services.
So Equitas Health has a lot of services, but they are all basically in Columbus. We are fortunate being so close to Columbus because I've gotten phone calls from mothers in Zanesville saying my kid is saying that they're having gender identity issues. Where can I take them? Columbus. Like that's the only answer. So it is a huge barrier, especially because like the Thrive Clinic and Nationwide is fantastic, but they have a very long wait list. But so there are services available, but a huge gap would be to how you access those services. So we do have gender affirming care. We do have a drop-in center in Columbus for younger trans folks. We have like gender affirming clothing and all the staff there are trans too. So it's just a very affirming space. We also have a bunch of support groups and those are available virtually. So if you just Google Equitas Health support groups, we have many different topics and the link to join is right there. So that is a very low barrier as long as, well, if you have internet connection, that would be another barrier. We do also have therapists. So while they are mostly based in Columbus, we are fortunate here. We do have community therapists that are able to come to Licking County. As long though, it's always an asterisk, as long as you're HIV positive. So HIV positive folks, we have resources to lower those barriers, but that is also a gap in services that if you are negative, I have less to offer you, like gap cards to get through these things. Another service gap I would say too is just kind of like what you said about the isolation in the community and feeling alone, especially the further out east you go, the more rural communities. A lot of folks will tell me like, you're the only one that knows I'm gay because I can't say it because it puts me in danger. So the more rural you get, the further those service gaps get. I will just throw this out there though. We do have a move van bus. It's huge. That comes to 195 Union Street. So where our old office used to be, they can do primary care, HIV care, and gender affirming care on bus. The next one is coming October 22nd. And the one after that is November 26th. So they come out once a month. They do advertise on Facebook. But if you just Google, again, Equitas Health, more information is there. I'm happy to talk with you after.
There's always an asterisk. Right? Like, why? Funding, right? That's part of it. That's always part of it. Money is always part of it, right? That just struck me when you said that. And Max, let me raise my hand real high to be like connected. Granville, right? Young people. So at the United Church of Granville, can I humble brag a little bit just for a moment? Okay. So we were and if I'm speaking out of turn, Linda, you let me know, we were the first church in the area to march in Columbus Pride back in the 90s, maybe 80s, 90s, something like that. Okay. So we've been at this for a long time. So that's my humble brag. I'm just gonna put it out there. So we are avid supporters of Pride. We were just out at New York Pride this past weekend. We participate in Pride events in Granville. We are affectionately known as the gay church, and that is totally cool with us. Like, we are so fine with that. If you've ever driven by our church, it is huge and stunning, and you will always see that beautiful rainbow flag outside. Because we want to message to people first and foremost that this might be a different church experience, right? So I think we all know that signs and symbols matter, right? They matter intensely. What I've been thinking about as I was listening to both of you talk, a gap, right? And I think Max gets back to a little bit of what you were saying, is finding and connecting people with safe communities where they feel like they can have full inclusion and belonging. I often critique the church for being, I'm using the language open and affirming or welcoming and affirming. I don't think that goes far enough. That to me conveys like, oh yeah, our doors are open, you're welcome here. I hope that we can get to a place where we can be embracing, where we can say, yes, we want you here. It's not just you can walk through the threshold. No, we want you to come, right? So language also matters in this conversation. So I would say a service gap, because the church writ large, capital C church, has done so much harm to this community. I won't get into my own testimony, but it's done harm to me. To have more safe spaces for members of the community to come where they can experience that embrace. Whether that is a faith-based community or a drop-in center or a support group. You know, I work in a faith-based space. And so I'm particularly invested in how can we push the envelope and always widen the circle and become more embracing. That is always the goal.
All right, thank you so much for your answers. So kind of, that's a perfect transition into our next question. At previous forums, we've talked about the need for social connection to combat loneliness and the variety of physical and mental impacts that it creates. How can we foster greater social connection for members of the queer community here in Lincoln County?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, we're different out there a lot that I love is community. We have a fantastic DEI person who has mentored me a lot about the importance of community. The government is not going to save us. We save us. We protect each other. They are actively harming our community. So we only have each other to rely on at this point. It's sometimes though, kids often are scared to reach out. And so we have to be the adults in the room and reach out to them. And let them know that you are I don't like to use the word safe spaces because you can never ensure 100% safety, so safer spaces. But to have somewhere where people can just live authentically is so important because especially for kids, they may not be safe at home to wear a dress. Can they go somewhere though to like feel what that feels to wear a dress around people that are very supportive? I recently had a friend bring a coworker who was figuring out their gender identity and they're like, this will be the first time I can wear a dress. Yes, come to my house. Let's all just like sit around and not talk about your transness either. We're just gonna talk to you because you're a human being and deserve our respect and love. Other ways you can bring community closer is meeting your neighbors. That's like a very small step is to just go and meet your neighbors. Also, again, just to really be a very vocal and visual supporter. So they know that you're a safe person. So like having a trans flag or having a rainbow flag, those are all really good indicators that while there are certain people that have rainbow flags that are jerks, but it at least is a good signal that you might be a safe person. So yes, to me, this is all about community and how do we build those safer spaces so that kids especially can really figure out who they are in a safe space, that they're not going to be outed to their parents, because there is the bill passed, so therapists have to disclose to the parents if they are trans. I am very proud that my sister is the executive director at NESW Ohio. They have developed a training to talk to therapists about how to document and like what is the line that we'd have to disclose to parents, to not go over that line, so that way kids still feel safe with their therapist and not that they're gonna call their parent who could potentially become very violent with that information. While I encourage all adults to be out and proud, kids cannot necessarily do that because it's not safe for many of them. And so to have a space is so invaluable, to make those connections from an early stage, to have mentors, to have people like Corey, like you can get through this and have a better life. That is such important messaging, especially right now when kids are being so targeted.
Yeah, so I think when we think about issues of social connection and loneliness, we also have to think about like the particular moment that we're in this sort of weird post-pandemic limbo where a lot of people want to connect in person. They want like those sort of in-person opportunities to forge new friendships, new relationships, but at the same time, folks are now also used to having that option of Zoom and are like, but wait, can I join virtually? So also opportunities for virtual connection that are perhaps more accessible for folks who don't have transportation or who have really busy work schedules. So I think that's one thing that we're kind of navigating is how can we have programs that reach people who want to be in person, but also provide opportunities for virtual connection for folks. I think when we think about different opportunities for social connection, something that's really valuable is intergenerational connection. So how can we connect queer young adults with queer elders who have lived through many of the different issues that queer communities have faced over time? How can we create those sort of connections? So for instance, thinking about students at Denison, how can we connect those young adults with LGBTQ communities outside of their age group? When I think about different opportunities for social connection, a ton come to mind, but every single one I can think of is located in Columbus. And there are a lot of folks who can't make it into Columbus. So I would love to see the development of those sort of things in Licking County as well. So I think, again, there's a barrier when we are so spread out and folks might not be able to make it to different types of groups. But a few different examples of things that exist in Columbus, Stonewall. Columbus has sports leagues, so people come together and play kickball or play softball. And allies can participate as well. It's not just LGBTQ folks. There's also like a queer crafting group in Columbus that meets every other week. There's a group of queer folks who just come together, meet up in the park and wear masks and read together for folks who are immunocompromised and might not be able to engage in other ways. There's drag shows, drag performances, though I think when we do think about developing programming, it is important to think about sober queer spaces as well. So what sort of like special interest groups there might be. There's Outrunners Columbus, so like a queer running group. So I think what these different examples demonstrate is there's opportunities to form social connection around interests that don't relate to gender or sexuality, right? If you just want to come together and knit with a bunch of other queer people, you can. So thinking about how we can integrate those sort of interests and hobbies and things that people are already doing and then do them together to offer that sort of structured connection.
Thank you both. Like this is a really it's becoming a perennial question, I think, as you name this post-pandemic reality that we find ourselves in, right? Because in this country, more and more people feel isolated than ever before. And I'm not even just talking about the LGBTQ plus community, I'm talking about everybody, right? More people are isolated than ever before. Suicide rates are higher than they have been, right? So this idea of loneliness and the need for community and connection reaches far beyond the LGBTQ plus community. However, I think has a particularity when we're talking about the LGBTQ plus community, right? So, you know, I would just say to you all, right? Where do you make most of your social connections? Does anybody want to respond to that? Where do you meet people? Work? Anybody else? Church, right? Okay, where else?
Bridge games.
Bridge games. Okay, there's one of those activities that Mac just referred to. Great. Anybody else? Book club activity, right? Okay, yeah. Community gardens. Okay, so I'm hearing I'm hearing some of what Mac suggested, right? Engaging around shared interests, right? Church, if folks have a particular affinity for a faith or religion or spirituality, and then work. I mean, those are, I feel like those are the major pockets. Do you, am I off base? That's where we make a lot of our connections, right? So I think as we think about fostering LGBTQ plus connections, I'd encourage us to think a little bit more creatively, right? And I can't say like I have some aha moment right now, but I think it's an opportunity for us to think more creatively about how we might leverage some of those spaces to promote greater inclusion and belonging. The other thing I wanted to say too, Breann, to what you said is, because not all safe spaces can be assured to be 100% safe, and some people are just jerks, and yeah, sure. Trauma-informed spaces, right? Trauma-informed spaces, working, regardless of what our contexts are, working to make them trauma-informed so we don't inflict further harm upon people who have been harmed. Yeah.
So I have a great idea. The garden club, you know, who doesn't have a lot of money for food, students. So I think that would be a really great opportunity to pull some younger kids in. Especially, I mean, when I was in Great State for like 6 years and lived in an apartment the whole time, I would have loved to like go dig in some dirt, because I didn't have a yard. And like, that would be, I think, a really good way. We have, Franklin Gardens in Columbus is very much expanding. Like, they have so much support from the community. And they also do a program that if you are on, food stamps, that you get like 75% off too. If you live in community, you get 50% off. So also opportunities to help, you know, the larger community as well. I also wanted just to like put into context when you mentioned the suicide attempt, and like, I don't want to bum people out, but since all this anti-trans legislation has passed, I have a cousin who's a doctor, so they posted this on Facebook, so I can get you like the actual source if you would like it, but there's been a 72% increase in suicide attempts from youth since these bills have been passed. Trans youth. 72% increase in suicide attempt from our trans youth, where states have passed anti-trans laws. So when we say this is life or death, it is truly life or death.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Breann, and thanks to all of you for your responses. Just to kind of insert a plug at the end of that question. If you're not familiar, we do have an affinity group called United in Pride. It is an LGBTQ plus affinity group of United Way. It's an opportunity for folks to come together around a shared interest. You might be familiar also with Women United, our other affinity group. And so we engage in activities, we plan community events. We are working toward a lot of things that we have ideas for right now. So I would invite any of you who are interested, whether you are a member of the queer community or if you are an ally, you're welcome to join us. We do have our steering committee, which meets the third Thursday of every month at 6 p.m. at the United Way office. But we do also have several people who are not members of the steering committee who are just interested in coming. Then we do try to have a social event afterwards. So I believe this month, here in just a couple of weeks, we'll be meeting and then painting pumpkins after our meeting. So lots of opportunities to engage. Ashley, did you have a comment?
Shameless plug.
Yes, I just want we're Family Health Services, it's my facility, and something that people don't usually know, and I feel like it's appropriate during this conversation, is Title 10 allows me to keep minors without parental consent. So if you're working with a minor who is struggling in our community about their gender, and need someone to talk to, bring them to Family Health Services, tell them about Family Health Services. We're definitely a safer space for them to kind of work through that and educate them on safe sexuality. And we work heavily with Equitas. We're a poppy provider through the Ohio Department of Health. We can do Equitas. So a local resource right on McMillan Drive that I feel like we're a hidden gem is Family Health Services. We are stigma-free healthcare for all, and that all includes minors without parental consent, which is huge. I don't think a lot of medical providers have that access. So if you do have a minor who unfortunately can't feel safe at home or talk to someone at home, you can certainly bring them to us to make you get them help.
Is there a base age that starts at, like
13, sorry, it changed. It used to be 14, it's 13 now.
13 now?
Great, yeah,
Thank you.
yeah.
Also, just to clarify, the POPPY program is to get folks on PrEP, which is like the birth control of HIV care. So if you take your pill every day, you don't get HIV.
Yeah, we have 340B pricing.
Yes,
for
so
that, right?
we can get you enrolled in it.
On
Be
McMillan
free.
Drive. So yeah, just a shameless plug, but I think, because we were talking about minors, it's hard, yeah, when a minor comes to you without parental consent, there's a lot of barriers there, and fortunately, those barriers aren't at Family Health Services, which is beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ashley. And thanks to the work that Family Health Services does for our community. They are truly a gem. And their staff, there's just nothing like them. They help us, they support her. Ashley is the chair of our Community Partners Council, and she is elected by our funded partners to a seat on our board. So we are very, very thankful for her. Okay. Next question, in your experience, how are people meeting needs for services that aren't available in Lincoln County? We have kind of talked about this, I think, already, but where are they traveling to, or are they even getting those needs met?
So currently they're either going to Columbus or they're not getting their needs met. Or they're doing more like your black market style and figuring out things on their own. Every once in a while you hear a horror story about someone getting gender affirming care in like a hotel room, right? Like it's not safe, obviously, but when you have no other options or you feel like you have no other options. They also, something that's very unique and especially the trans community is word of mouth. So a lot of folks know where to go if they are connected into those communities of places that will affirm them and treat them well. So there will be like local pockets of people that have formed groups, like their own little communities to give each other support. But they're not, if you don't know about it, you're not invited, then you wouldn't be part of it. It's not like a formal come join us kind of thing. So I would say either Columbus or not at all.
So for this question, when we think about services, I want to explain a little bit about legislation just to make sure we're all on the same page. So within Ohio, there have been a total of 13 different anti-LGBTQ bills introduced that are at different statuses within the legislative process. So the bill that is one of the bills that is most relevant right now is called HB 68, which was passed and went into effect. So this bill went through a long legislative process. Governor DeWine vetoed it, but then that veto was overridden. There was a legislative challenge. That challenge failed. So HB 68 is now a law. And HB 68 has two different aspects to it that impact trans young people in the state. So one part of HB 68 is it makes it illegal to provide gender affirming care to minors in the state. Gender affirming care can mean many different things, but one aspect of gender affirming care is access to medical care. So in particular, for minors, they might have access to things like puberty blockers that would prevent them from going through pubertal transition, and then HRT or hormone replacement therapy, where people take hormones that help their bodies match their gender identities or how they feel about their gender. So HB 68 outlaws that care for minors. However, there is a grandfather clause to HB 68. So people who were previously accessing gender affirming care, minors who were previously accessing gender affirming care are able to continue with that care. But minors who are seeking access to that care and have not had it before cannot access that within the state of Ohio. The other aspect of HB 68 is involving trans women in sports. This involves both K through 12 as well as the collegiate level in both public and private institutions. So trans women or non-binary people who were assigned male at birth are not able to participate in women's sports. So those two things have happened with the bill. And so I think we've seen a massive shift in need for services following the enactment of that bill. So access to medical care is a major, major issue. And something that's not fun to say out loud, but that it's our reality right now, is there is nowhere that is safe. You know, we might think about like Licking County and the particular needs of Licking County, and services are not being met here, so people are going to Columbus. The services are not safe in Columbus either. Minors still can't access gender affirming care in Columbus, not necessarily safe in Ohio. There have been, I can provide anecdotal stories about several people who are trans youth whose families have moved out of state. That's also not necessarily safe because we're looking ahead to November and don't know what will happen at the federal level. I also know people who are trans adults who have moved out of the country. And again, it's not even like those countries that they're moving to are safe either, right? So we can't necessarily guarantee continued access to services and care because there's nowhere where we can say things are going to continue to be safe. So while there are services being offered in Columbus, I think those services are still precarious. Trans adults are concerned about, if we look at legislative trends in other states, will there be legislation targeting access to HRT for adults as well? That could be coming down the pipeline. Yeah, there's been instances in Ohio where they have tried to put legislative rules in place around that too. So I think Columbus is right now a hub for services, but that it's important to realize that it may not continue to be, and there may not even be places out of state that will continue to be hubs for services, depending on what happens at the federal level.
What a like harrowing reality to have to speak about. Like I'm borderline speechless. And that doesn't happen very often. Yeah, they're going to Columbus, so they're not getting their needs met. So speaking from a faith-based context, right? There are not many open and affirming churches in Licking County. I don't know how many there are. If anyone knows of one, raise your hand and let me know who they are besides the United Church of Granville. I don't know how many there are.
Deb's church back then. Deb is also a pastor.
Oh, well, Deb, yeah, Deb, of course. Deb. There aren't many of us in this county, right? So for adults, for young people who may be having questions about faith, religion, spirituality, where do they go? Where do they go? There aren't many of us that exist. And for those of us who do exist, well, our reality is an interesting one, I would say. Just this year alone, we've had our pride flag stolen twice, right off our building. The last time somebody pulled it down so hard that it actually bent the flagpole. It's like really impressive. So we had to buy a new one and anchor it even higher on the building so that people couldn't get to it. I can't tell you how many times I've shown up on a Sunday or just during the week and there's been some sort of biblical tract posted on our door. to tell me how damned we are. Because homosexuality, always, never for another reason, is always that. Or the folks that show up on the corner with bullhorns on our corner to scream and yell about hellfire and brimstone, right? So I say all that because if you're a person who, again, from a faith-based context, if you're a person who wants to explore these things, and this stuff is going on, might give you pause. It might give you pause because inside we might be really, really safe. We might be really, really trauma-informed, but if you see what's going on outside, you might not think that. Because everything is a risk. I'll tell you right now, just from my own anecdotal, life, we have an election coming up. I'm exhausted. I don't know about you, but I'm exhausted. I have no signs outside my home. And that is because I have a wife who has said, I don't want to draw any extra attention to ourselves. I respect that. And it's really unfortunate because it gets back to what you're saying, which is like, we're not safe. We are not safe.
Yeah, thank you. I think also, speaking of the election and the, as Breann said, the increase since trans legislation has been ramping up, increase in suicide attempts and, just suicidal ideation among LGBTQ plus youth is through the roof. And I think there are so many, constantly being bombarded with overtly negative speech about trans people is damaging, whether you're trans or not, because I'm not a trans individual, but trans people are still part of my community. They're still, I don't understand their experiences because I have not lived them, but we share so much shared experience that even if I were a 10-year-old, not trans, but queer and trying to figure out life, and I'm being bombarded with this messaging, it's extremely damaging. And I think not only, we have to address the inherent misogyny in the question of trans females playing women's sports. Just recently there was an article in the local newspaper about a girl scoring on a football team. Boys, all boys football team, of course. And good for her, awesome, we celebrate that. But the reverse is never true. Because broadly, females, people who are born female, are still thought to be less capable than people who are born male. And that is really at the core of this conversation, which we're better than them. And so I think, and then there's so much talk about gender affirming care. Well, let me tell you, breast augmentation is gender affirming care. Hair implants are gender affirming care. So there are so many ways that Viagra, yeah. There are so many ways that we use medical intervention or whatever means we can to outwardly express the gender that aligns with our perception of ourselves all the time. So, it's just, those are things that just don't even get me going, because clearly I take a spotlight that's not really meant to be mine right now when it comes to that. So, that's what I kind of think. So anyway, all right, so I digress. Next question. So actually, I kind of want to deviate from these questions a little bit because I want to dig into this conversation a little bit more, especially talking about gender affirming care. And I'm not sure if any of you on the panel are aware, anyone in the community, in the room here is aware, gender affirming care is a enormous gap in Lincoln County. And by gap, I mean it's like a non-existent thing in Lincoln County. Ashley mentioned, there are services that are gender affirming services that they can provide, but if someone is, a trans youth or trans adult or whatever their age or situation might be, trying to get access to that care is nearly impossible if they don't have the means to get to Columbus or somewhere else. Is anybody aware of any type of services, any experience that is at least in some minuscule amount gender affirming that is currently provided in the community?
Newark Breakfast. So that was just on Saturday. One of my coworkers was, Miss Cherry Poppins is the MC, love them. And he and I were talking before, again, we work together, and he said it was his favorite pride he goes to. And I asked him why. He said, because of the kids there living so authentically themselves. And our office was, part of the start of Pride back in 2017. And to see it grow to what it is, like, I was telling the organizer, we couldn't even fill the middle part our first year, and now it's like expanding every direction. But what hasn't changed is the kids that are there and interacting with elders and each other and just having like the best time. I was smiling because like they would go up to ask the drag queens for a picture, and when they were running away, it looked like they had like just met Beyonce. They were so excited. And yeah, I think that is a great space because it is such a community of love. And I hope that that Pride continues to be like that, because I think it's such a great example of what could be in Lincoln County.
I'm hopeful to hear that you have the bus coming.
And we have the bus coming.
That's huge, yes, I think that's gonna help my clients a lot, we can refer to. Yeah, that's exciting, yes.
Other sad things that are happening for our youth is there are also people that will help you get out of state to get your gender affirming care if it is not available to you. And Canada has offered LGBTQ refugee status as well. So many of my friends are starting to make plans if November goes badly.
All right. So if you could wave a magic wand and money was no issue and time and effort were no consideration, and you could see one thing instantly available locally for the LGBTQ plus community, what do you feel would be the #1 immediate need?
Affordable housing.
Across the board.
So no matter who you are, there is a severe housing crisis. You had mentioned it earlier about the homeless folks and like the tent cities that are being destroyed in every community, including Columbus. There are a lot of LGBTQ folks in those tents. There are a lot of LGBTQ homeless kids are the vast majority. I think it's over 50% are LGBTQ kids, mostly because they're like kicked out of their houses. So we need affordable housing, not just housing, because like, again, in Columbus, there's apartments going up every day, and then you look and it's $2,000 a month. That's not affordable. We also need to look at, as our or especially like our people living with HIV or aging, there are not specific nursing homes for LGBTQ people. There's still very archaic laws in a lot of them, where if you were born and assigned birth at male, you will be with a male in the room, no matter what your gender identity is. And that is obviously traumatic and could be very unsafe for that person. Same for prisons, they also do that, putting people at risk. So there are a lot of things, but I think it all starts with housing. Not to get too social worky, but if you look at like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the very first step is housing, food, clean water. If we aren't getting those things, we cannot progress to medical even. So like when I have someone come in newly diagnosed and you're homeless, my first priority is not getting you on HIV meds, is to get you housed. If you want to. There are people that do like to live in the tent cities. We need to protect their right to live on public lands and not go in and destroy everything they have. We have Safe Point, which is a needle exchange program in Columbus, and they work very closely with the tent cities in Columbus. And I have a partner that works at Harbor Freight, so I can get tarts discounted I am constantly buying them because of how many times their police are taking everything these people own. And then, you know, it rained a whole bunch. Can you imagine being out and having no shelter? When there's a heat wave, especially in Lincoln County, they did not open any cooling centers. If you follow the Newark, what is it, Homeless Coalition on Facebook, church does amazing work of advocating for cooling stations, that like they turned off the water fountain, like very basic needs for our community. I also, when people talk about increased drug use, and I don't want to see these people on the street. Okay, well, then give them housing. Every person on the face of the earth, I don't care who you are, you can be the worst person, that you deserve medical care, housing, and clean water. Period, end of story. And until we invest in that, we are going to continue to have societal problems. Because again, if we're not meeting those basic needs, there's no way to progress to the other steps of like being a full person.
So I would echo much of what Breann just said. I think there are a couple different approaches that we can take to LGBTQ issues. And one way is looking at LGBTQ issues as what's called a single issue politics. So LGBTQ issues deal with gender and sexuality and only gender and sexuality. And historically, the mainstream LGBTQ movement, primarily through the early 2000s, took a single issue politics approach where we're going to work on gender, or we're going to work on marriage equality, we're going to work on the issue of gay people in the military, and those are our gay issues. But as Breann is speaking to, I think it's much more productive and socially just to approach LGBTQ issues from an intersectional politics. So we have to think about all of the different aspects of social justice that impact queer people's lives. So we have to think about things like racism and policing and affordable housing and ableism and access to medical care, and every single intersecting ism that impacts queer people's lives. Because there are unhoused queer people, there are people of color who are queer, there are poor people who are part of the LGBTQ community, disabled people. So if we pick gender and sexuality as our single optic or our single lens, then all we're doing is elevating those who are closest to privilege already to that level of privilege and leaving everyone else behind. So I really advocate for this sort of intersectional lens where we're looking at all of the different aspects that impact people's lives, and holistically how people show up. So one thing is, yeah, that sort of shift away from a single issue politics towards an intersectional politics. Another thing before I say what I would actually do with my magic wand, is, so I've been talking a lot about legislation. That's going to be a common refrain. But I think when we talk about legislation, it's also important to look at it in two ways. So one is we see the actual legislation that's happening. We see like this bill is being introduced and impacting folks in this way. People no longer have access, minors no longer have access to gender affirming care, or trans women cannot play sports. So there are the tangible aspects related to the bill. But at the same time, we are also witnessing cultural shifts. So when there are politicians who are using intentionally pejorative language, who are furthering intentionally harmful rhetoric, that rhetoric gets picked up more broadly and culturally as well. So your neighbor then feels more empowered to use a slur or to say something that makes a LGBTQ person feel unsafe. So while this legislation is happening, it's also leading to these sort of cultural shifts in the way that people experience the world more broadly beyond just legislation. So if I would wave my magic wand, I think the legislation happening in Ohio is what's most urgent to address given the tangible impacts on folks' lives. So I talked about HB 68. We also have, I forget if it's HB or SB 183, the bathroom bill, which would impact K through 12 schools as well as institutions of higher education, including private institutions. So meaning that folks would have to use the bathroom, of their sex assigned at birth, and could face punishments for not doing so. While queer and trans people are most impacted by this legislation, I also like to emphasize that everyone is impacted by it. So for instance, at Denison, the university's ability to recruit and retain the most talented faculty is at risk. If you think about your jobs and, you know, recruiting folks for like a national type search, depending on the type of work you do, again, personal anecdote, but I know several professors who are at the top of their field in things like physics or anthropology who either have trans kids or are thinking of becoming pregnant, and if they have children, do not want to live in the state of Ohio. So it impacts our access to the best sort of resources, as well as medical care, you know, doctors being scared to practice in the state of Ohio. So while it's crucial to center the impact on queer and trans people of this legislation is harming everyone within Ohio. So that would be what I would wave my magic wand to change.
Okay, I have a fun one to the bathroom comment. If I could wave a magic wand, all bathrooms would be gender neutral, and there would be one marked urinals, and there'd be one just marked bathrooms, and there would be no gas in the stall, and it would be safe for everyone.
Seriously.
Also, there have been attacks on cis women who people have assumed their gender identity and have harmed them. So like the boxer in the Olympics, people just assumed her gender identity and then attacked this person. So cis women have been attacked in bathrooms because their assumed gender identity. So before I pass it over, just always keep in mind that the way people present their gender does not equal gender identity.
You should have just dropped the mic after that.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you've been keeping up with the news, you may have seen some news. I think it came out of, is it Pittsburgh? Who has seen this? That they're cutting windows in bathrooms now so that like they can monitor who's using
Yeah,
which
it
bathroom.
was a school in Pennsylvania. I think it was in rural Pennsylvania. I just read an article about that.
Yeah.
It has since, I think, been boarded up because of outcry, but
I
it
mean,
was created, yeah.
I'm Google. I'm just like, you're talking about bathrooms and I'm not gonna say what I'm thinking. Yeah, I mean, I love the memes, you know, I get in the social media realm where they're like, did you grow up with siblings? Then you've used the gender neutral restroom, like, what, okay, anyway, I digress. Intersectionality, yes, we need to consider those things. Housing, yes, we need to consider all those things. Here's my magic wand moment. If I could just wave a magic wand, I would kind of just like take up everything that you both described and just call it flourishing and make flourishing available to LGBTQ plus folks across the board. Like people would have the ability to flourish.
Seems like a simple request.
Corey, are you sure?
On that note, is there any of you who would like to speak up? If I gave you a magic wand right now and you could wave it and you could have one thing, in the community, anybody want to share what theirs would be?
Honestly, I could provide all of those resources without a problem. Yeah.
Yeah.
Universal healthcare is what I hear there.
Yeah.
That my husband and my son could go out of the house every morning and I would not have to worry about them being harmed because of who they know themselves to be.
Yes.
Yeah, safety. Seems like a basic human right to me, but unfortunately not one that so many experience. Anybody else?
It seems simple, but those bar commercials that traumatize my child.
Yeah.
I would just say more education on like a public school level about LGBTQ history and normalizing it so that it's rooted in like the foundation of their education. And there's less, I guess,
Also better sex ed that
better
includes
sex ed.
LGBTQ.
Yeah.
And it is LGBTQIA plus history month.
Yes.
So there's
Yeah. Yeah, no, I definitely agree. Representation and just normalizing the existence of, people will say, everybody's trans these days. I don't understand pronouns these days. Everybody blah, blah, blah these days, because people think it's a modern occurrence. But that's because, we have been systematically wiped from and purposefully wiped from any, discourse on that. There are plenty of things out there if you really want to dig in and realize like, oh no, this is, we didn't just appear one day. We didn't, hatch out of the egg in Roswell or whatever, So we've been around and we're not going anywhere. Okay, so, oh, sorry.
I do have a question. I have 3 children and my youngest one, she's 17. She's the most, her best friends are non-binary. And she has been so gracious with me, correcting me and telling me all the things that I needed to know. I'm curious, how do you see youth nowadays? Because I also know that there are kids her same age who are totally bullies when it comes to that. Do you see any changes happening in that sense?
So I do think it's improved from like when I was a kid. Because social media is really bad in a lot of ways, but one really good thing that it does is connect people. So if you are like, I'm the only trans person here, you can get online and connect with other trans people. Same for like the body positivity movement. I think that is because of social media and seeing different kinds of body shapes and things. Kids are kind of mean anyways, and so they're like always want to pick on someone. Also, I also question if they're internalized issues going on that person will later discover. But it is tough. I think I'm so glad I don't have to go back to school ever again because, yeah, I think just anyone that's different is always going to be an easy target. It's always, what I've always heard is like, as soon as your kid is ready to like start expressing their gender identity, the earlier the better, so kids can kind of like get used to it. And then you also don't have to worry about like the switching names and pronouns and things, but I want to go back to what you said earlier about learning. And also I think what you had brought up earlier is like not being scared to ask. So if your question is coming from a place of kindness and genuine curiosity, no one is probably going to mind you asking that. Do not ask though about what private parts they have. That is none of your business. Don't ask about surgeries. None of your business. Google it if you're really interested to see how it works. Because you wouldn't like someone asking you that. But like my cousin has recently announced they're non-binary. And so now their pronouns are they them. And my mom struggled with it because my mom is very used to calling this person she, her for, how old is she, 30-something years? And we have lots of talk about it. And every time my mom messes it up, I just say, hey, because that's how I learned at Equitas. Every time I messed up, someone would correct me or correct myself. It's fine to make mistakes. We're human. Especially like in a heated moment or like you're just going. I misgendered someone yesterday. Like, and immediately though was like, oh, sorry. You don't need to make it a big deal. You don't need to stop everything. I am so sorry. How dare I? Like, just correct it, move on, try not to do it again. All we want is for people to come to us with like love and kindness. And as long as you're producing that, we're not going to be upset if you're like, can you explain why you use they, them pronouns? Or I don't understand that should be a plural. What do you mean? It can be singular. That's the question. Even though you do it all the time. Also, my sister has good advice with that. If you meet someone that's non-binary, they, them is no longer plural. It is now singular. So if they say they mean just themselves. But also you can just ask questions. Like clarifying questions are always fine. again, as long as it's not heated or like you just keep questioning them, and trying to like invalidate their experience. You just need to believe what people tell you. Their experience is their experience, and their story is their story. And that's how you get to know people too, right? Like it's any human of, tell me more about how you grew up. Tell me more about that church that you were in. Like those are questions you can ask anybody and get to know them as a human being, which I think is often left out of these conversations, is that like, we're all still human and we all just want to have conversations and for those conversations to not all revolve around our identities. 'Cause like, we're whole people. We have other things in life other than that.
Yeah, I think we're seeing a lot of promising trends among young people. So I think it's 1 in 5 Gen Z people identify as part of the LGBTQ community. And when I present that statistic, I always like to reiterate, it's not like there's suddenly some sort of explosion of LGBTQ people, but we can think about the cultural conditions that now make it safe for people, relatively safer for people to come out compared to previous generations. I lead our Safe Zone workshops at Denison, which is a training about LGBTQ identities and communities. And in that presentation, I ask students at the beginning, like, what's the first thing you ever remember learning about an LGBTQ person? I know for me as a millennial, I'm 35, so like much of what I encountered was in the media and negative representations. There's a great Netflix documentary called Disclosure, I think, that kind of traces media representations around trans people. But yeah, so I think in my generation, like it was a lot of media encounters about LGBTQ communities and negative portrayals, versus now most of the students that I talk to, they're saying, oh, my first encounter with the LGBTQ community was by meeting a friend in elementary school who was gay or non-binary or trans. So I think those sort of interpersonal relationships, like you mentioned with your kid, are really kind of shaping people's perceptions and leading to a greater sense of acceptance.
I just want to affirm that you're having conversations.
Yep.
That's amazing. I think it gets back to what you were talking about, just the willingness to be curious and to listen and to learn is a huge first step. So kudos to you.
Yeah, thank you. So just for the interest of time, I just want to make sure that you all, if you have any questions that you would like to ask the panel, that you're utilizing those slips on your tables. So they are the skinny, some of them are green, but we have since reprinted them. I don't know what year those green ones were printed, but we're finally running out of our stock of those, so now they're white. But the narrow slips of paper, if you would like to ask questions, go ahead and write those on those slips of paper. I do want to make sure we have plenty of time to address your questions as well. I am going to ask another question of the panel while my friends are gathering those questions for us. So we've touched on this some, we've seen so many changes in the last few decades with things like marriage equality, the increase in visibility of gender identity and gender expression, and a massive increase in peer representation in the media. However, we are still facing negativity, homophobia, transphobia daily in our communities. So in light of all of that, what advice, insight, or wisdom do you have to share with today's queer youth that you wish someone had told you?
That even though you feel alone, there's probably people in your class that are also struggling with the same thing, and you probably won't find out till years later. Something my mom said something like, well, there's no trans people there. And I said, well, no, there is. There's not out. There's a difference. I wanted to just hang in there. I think being a kid is difficult, no matter what identities you hold. It's a tough time. So to also be politically active from a young age, we need people to vote, even though it feels like nothing's changing at this point. We are trying to prevent something that would devastate the country. And I think also with social media, to really be mindful of who you're following and use that block button and unfollow button. I understand the point of like, we need to see both sides, but the other side does not need to be hate. You do not need to be pulling up on Facebook to like see what your friends wore for homecoming and see a Bernie Moreno ad that will, like, for me as a cis person, are triggering, so I can't even imagine. But I have made a very big effort that 99% of what I see on Facebook is positive towards the communities I hold. And yes, that does keep me in a microcosm, because Equitas, I think, oh, everyone's like this, and then I meet other people and they're not like that. But I think it's important for your mental health and your mental well-being to see positive affirmations of your identities on social media, and to try your hardest to like block the people that are trying to bring you down. Because that's another point of the bullying that I can't imagine. Like, luckily, I'm old enough to have missed Facebook in high school. Because I had a hard time in school, right? Like, I was bullied in school, and I can't imagine going home and it like still continuing. And so for those, they're super at risk then, right? Like, especially if they don't have a supportive house. So that would be my advice, is to really pay attention to social media and to disengage as much as possible. Because it's just not good for your mental health at all.
So I think my advice isn't just for youth, but for everyone. One of my personal affirmations for our current moment is, for as long as there is oppression, there will also be resistance. So I think that we're looking at this kind of backswing in terms of backlash against queer and trans communities. But queer and trans communities have a long history of resilience. We have a long history of joy, of survival in face of unspeakable and incredibly difficult odds. So thinking back to the AIDS crisis and the incredible advocacy and activism and survival that brought queer and trans communities through that crisis is a sort of history that we can draw on. So again, that sort of intergenerational relationship building and contact can, I think, be so crucial in remembering that, like, queer and trans people have been fighting for a really long time, and we will continue to fight. So just having youth know that, like, there are supportive people doing this work. For me personally, as someone doing work around queer and trans issues, it can sometimes be difficult when we look at the sort of national landscape, statewide landscape, everything that's happening. It just seems like kind of a constant onslaught. So I also like to remind myself that, like, we are never singular people doing this work, but there are lots of folks, lots of organizations who are doing this incredible work of support. And as a movement, we will ultimately see transformation. So doing one single step, whether that be having a conversation with someone who's close to you, whether that be getting involved with an organization, whether that just be supporting someone in your life, all of those little steps add up and ultimately lead to change.
So I wish somebody would have sat me down when I was, I don't know, early preteen, early teen, something like that. I wish somebody would have sat me down and looked me straight in the eye and said, Alissia, I see you, and you don't have to be ashamed. And from a faith context, you are precious and beloved before God. I think those simple statements would have changed the trajectory of my life and my struggle. I'm not lamenting the fact that I struggled. It made me the person I am today. However, that would have been nice. And a big fat hug. Yeah, for sure. Like bear hug.
All right, thank you all for sharing. We're going to get to some questions from the audience. I want to make sure that we do have plenty of time. So we do have some great questions from folks. Alissia, this might be geared a little bit more toward you, but of course, anyone who has insight on this is welcome to chime in. So the question is, have you seen an increase of acceptance in religious spaces, or does it seem like nothing is changing?
I wish I could say yes. I'm inclined to say otherwise. I think that the unfortunate rise of Christian nationalism within spaces of worship is intersectional with how we view LGBTQ folks and their humanity or lack thereof. I wish I could say it was getting better. I don't mean to be dour with you, but I think the reality is that it may be getting worse right now. But that is true, Breann. There is less conversion therapy that has been outlawed in many states, which is a positive. And yet there is this strain of queer and transphobia that continues to run like a current under our churches.
So I am the Equitas Health Workers United president of our union. So I go to lots of conferences and we're affiliated with the Ohio Federation of Teachers. So I hear lots of what's like going to be happening in schools because they're obviously actively working to resist that. One thing that they're trying to do, and they did this to me in elementary school, so it's not new, is take kids out of school and go to a church and get church lessons.
Very common here in county.
Likewise, yes. So when I had it, it was fun. Like we just sang songs and like, I still know some of them. And it was just like these two lovely ladies that like reenacted the stories, like the fun stories with puppets and stuff. So like mine was not scary. The ones they're doing now are scary. Once you're out of school, the protection for those kids goes away. And so they will be in those rooms hearing that they're damned to hell. Their friends will hear that. So even if you are taking your kids to an affirming church, what are they learning in school? And now with book bans, where do they even go to get the information to counter that? My mom was very strict about what I watched on television, but she did not care what I read. The library was open game for me. And that is where I developed my love of reading and learning different people's stories. It's where I loved the history because I would like really research really weird topics. But yeah, I think that all of this compounds to we can do everything right in a lot of spaces, but like if this legislation continues, we're fighting an uphill battle. And it's important to be aware of these things that are coming in that don't necessarily need to be like legislative. I don't have kids, so I would not have known that was happening unless I went to this conference, but it's scary that it seems like as much as they want to say we're indoctrinating kids to become gay, it seems like they're indoctrinating kids to be hateful. And we need to be mindful of that.
So I can't speak to the church overall, but just to share a quick personal anecdote. So I was raised evangelical, Republican in the South. My parents were incredibly religious. And just to, while we're witnessing these sort of concerning trends at the national level, particularly around Christian nationalism, my parents personally, it took about 10 years of having conversations with them. So it was not immediate, it was not quick, it was an ongoing process. It involved lots and lots of returning to that topic. But after about 10 years of conversations, my parents are now supportive. They go to an affirming church. I am no longer religious, but they came to visit me for Christmas, and they looked up churches online in Columbus so that because they were going to make me go. So that way they could bring me to an affirming church, and there were multiple different options of affirming churches there. So I think while we're witnessing these sort of concerning trends in so many different areas, including the church, these sort of personal anecdotes are also really important because individual experiences also matter. So while we might not be seeing shifts in the way that we would like across the board, I think individual experiences can also be a source of hope. And just remembering that change does not happen overnight. It can take a really long time.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. You know, even just in my own experience, it took me a really long time to kind of settle with myself and recognize, you know, fully accept this is my reality. I'm, you know, locked into this experience. I can't change it. And I know how much work that was for me personally, and that's the perspective I've tried to take with my family, which I don't know that we'll ever get there, but, you know, we just can't expect people to change overnight. And I think, a lot of us who grew up queer kind of understand that. And a lot of our friends who are allies are kind of having these realizations for the first time of the situation. And so a lot of times I hear people, they're outraged, and I appreciate and honor their outrage, and I thank them for, you know, being alongside us and being vocal about it. But sometimes you almost want to be like, okay, it's not gonna happen overnight. Like, you know, you might have had a very like revelatory moment to change your perspective, but not everybody's going to do that. So I think that's a really good, you know, it might be a little exhausting, but it's just good to keep in mind.
There's a meme I shared the other day of like a stone building, and it said what we need to build, and then there's a picture right beside it, and there's only like a couple blocks, and it said what we can do today. You know, it's like the Rome's not built in a day kind of thing. We have to make these small steps. And another reality is that we may not live to see these changes, but we need to do them so that future generations have a better world than we're currently in, even if we don't get to benefit from it.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, to get back to some of the questions from the audience, someone asked, what is the best way to learn about terminology, understanding of whether it's, you know, using the correct pronouns, using the correct terms, being patient, you know, with someone. What are the best resources that you know of to help folks who are trying to learn how to be a good ally?
I have a plug. So we have at Equitas, it's called the Institute. You do have to pay them to come, but they will come and train you on all of that. It is led by a trans woman too, who is very open to questions, and will tell you, like, I'll answer that question, but never ask another person that question ever again. So yes, the Institute is a fantastic place if you are looking to like bring them into your workplace to give a training. There's also YouTube videos, but obviously you have to be very careful on the internet. Start with like the GLAAD websites and like those really obvious pro LGBT sites. Many of them have resources. If you're looking for like really basic terminology, YouTube, the gender unicorn, is kind of out of fashion now, but it will give you a really good head start on pronouns and things like that. They also get into like the gender identity is not gender expression. So that's a really good like short intro, but read books that are written by people in the community. There's Sarah McBride, who was elected to a Senate in some East state, I can't remember. She wrote a book. It's very good. That's a trans person's experience of working in the government as well. I can't remember the name of the book, but it's Sarah McBride is for sure her name. But yeah, just read books, watch things, listen to podcasts, just make sure that they are led by LGBTQ folks. If it's led by a white, cis, straight man, click next. Do not, that's probably, I'm not saying that they all couldn't give good information. I'm just saying beware if that is the author when you're on media. But yeah, just Google things. There's lots of stuff out there. Just be, again, mindful of like the source and who is presenting the information.
I say one of the best things is ask your friend.
Ask your friend.
What resources they trust.
Yeah.
And what things on YouTube and that they've used as, and they know the information is.
Yeah.
That the person is supportive and part of the community. But I think that's what I do.
Yeah.
When people ask me.
Yeah, again, like the LGBTQ folks have such like a network amongst us that we're,
Who's safe and who's
Yes.
not safe and where the information's coming from.
Mhm.
So it's, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, another thing would be, again, if you have someone in your life that is identifying in the LGBTQIA community, is to ask if you can have a conversation to better understand them as a human. Again, we don't have about surgeries that they've had, but unless they offer that. But most people love to talk about themselves. So give them the opportunity to talk about their life and how they got there and their experience and how they want you to identify them. You should never assume someone's pronoun, for example. You can just ask, what pronoun do you use? I use she, her. Leave it open for them to respond. I have like pronoun pins on my lapel here because that way they know that I am not one of those people that are going to yell about pronouns and how they're not important. They are important. They are literally life-saving for kids. It's just invalidating people's identity if they say, I want you to call me this, and you don't. It is not a big deal just to use a different name. Many people change their names when they get married, you call them by their new name. Like, it's not a big deal. People change their names all the time. But to dead name someone or to use the wrong pronouns could lead to them making some very devastating permanent choices in their life.
Yeah, I think you all have offered some great resources. A few additional ones that I would add would just be, again, emphasizing GLAAD and other like kind of national organizations that provide information online. So some others would be the Trevor Project, has some great resources, and also the Human Rights Campaign, again, historically has kind of taken a rather single issue approach to LGBTQ issues, but I do think that many of their resources are also helpful. I don't know if there's any way to distribute it, but I have a resource sheet about trans communities, and in particular, some creators who are helpful to follow if you are on social media. I think because things evolve so rapidly, social media can actually be a great place to go for education. My favorite person to follow in terms of legislation in particular is Chase Strangio, Strangio. He is a lawyer with the ACLU leading the sort of national campaign for LGBTQ rights and protections legally. And then I also do want to mention just again and reiterate that degree of media literacy that's so crucial when we're reading information about queer and trans communities. If you're not aware, the New York Times has been called out repeatedly and multiple times by several very important and reputable people for biased coverage of trans issues. So I still personally read the New York Times to follow on what's happening and how they're reporting, but if you are using that as one of your news sources, do just keep that in mind if you're reading about trans issues.
Oh, question?
Yeah, Corey, that's kind of a question I was asking myself, as a grandparent of a trans teenager. Finding those resources is challenging as well. But I also wondered if there are actually, I hesitate to use the word support group, but places where parents and grandparents of LGBTQ children can get together and talk about the challenges, the difficult experiences they may have had, and share those in that kind of an environment where it's trusting and there's some feedback there that's more, more personal than feeling, you're kind of alone when you're wandering on the internet trying to learn about anything. And so I just wondered if those kind of resources exist.
I'm pretty sure they do. I'm Googling now, but I think they do exist.
Here.
So it'd be virtual. But I have heard from like just being semi-involved with that's been something they've brought up a lot so that might be something to work with the Pride Coalition on, to get that started, but yeah.
Just, I don't see anyone else here from Middle America, but fun to do a pitch for Colleen. A big initiative that we do is the Yes Club.
Yes.
And it's a space for young people to get together and have space together. So it's not just on their own on the internet.
Yes. Yeah, the Yes Club is great. But that's where I first heard that parent support group idea pop up. So you're not the only one with it.
So the Yes group has.
I don't think they have it up and running, but that's something that, yeah, definitely for the future. I think it's all, yeah.
I definitely agree that there's a need. I'm a transgender person, but I'm also the parent of a transgender
Yeah.
child.
Right.
So it's like, and as a trans person, I don't know how to navigate the needs for my trans child.
Yeah.
And so I have my worries and the things that I know he deals with, but I don't deal with them. So I think it is important for the parents and grandparents and anybody to have someplace to go and talk about it, because we feel like we're lacking sometimes in what we should do. I mean, as
I will
much as I
message Jen
can.
after this and see if we can just get that worked on. Because I think it's,
That's definitely something United and Pride, through United Way would be interested in.
I'm not gonna say.
yeah, we tried.
But if there's more.
But if there's more need for adults and for parents and grandparents, you know, absolutely, that is something that we're open to, that, you know, we could work with NOPC and maybe Granville Pride and do a collaborative effort. But I think it's really important that, even though, you know, we are experiencing the communities ourselves, raising our children is a totally different situation.
it's also a completely different world for him. Yeah.
It's like, for me, it's like, I was just like, when my son came out to me, you know, with that information, it was like, okay. I mean, he's in the Thrive program at Children's and things like that, and making sure he has everything in place for himself, so that he can move forward into adulthood with all, knowing what he can do for himself. But it's just, it's a different game. Especially, I didn't transition until I was 50 years old. So I lived, you know, entire lifetime without all the experience of you being able to be myself. And so we found ways to support. We've worked with the school systems. We've found ways to, you know, nobody knows he's transgender. You know, he goes to school and nobody knows. You know, we've been able to change his birth certificate, able to do everything. School systems worked with transferring him so he could start fresh without, you know, any problems. I mean, it's been
But
a
not every
great
child has the
experience.
opportunity.
Right, I think that a lot of people won't even know how to do that.
We had to find those things.
Right.
We had to talk to the school systems, and we had to talk, you know, to the people and find the people that could make sure that he would be taken care of. So.
That is an incredible experience that I'm sure other people, parents and grandparents would love to have.
We would be able to give, tell the parents where to go.
So I would, offer you to, let's talk after,
Yeah.
after this and see, you know,
I think it's definitely.
what we can do.
Maybe get some started.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Awesome. David, did you have a question?
Yeah, I just want to mention that the group called P-Flag, this is at a national level. P-Flag, it's national level, been around since the 70s. Parent support group and for families about.
That's great.
You're welcome.
Yeah, lots of great input. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Breann, for sharing about your experience. I think there's a good point also. There is so much to draw from community. And, you know, rather than placing the expectation on the individual that you want to help, you know, it's not necessarily their burden to educate you. So I think drawing on those community resources is super important. And I know there are plenty of people in the community who would be willing to kind of offer that information. And I think another good point is you don't have to know every detail of a person's experience, because it is safe to assume that if you hear something that's happened to someone, your family, friend, whoever it is, has probably experienced the same or similar. And I think just taking that consideration goes a long way into fostering empathy. Because even if they haven't, secondary trauma is a thing, and just, you know, by virtue of being a part of the community, it can be a traumatic experience. So just kind of gleaning the sensitivity that we can from that. So I know we're getting close to time. I'll ask one more question. I do have to call out, we had a very special comment from someone, not a question. And I'm pretty sure this came from Patty. I think she has left. She said that she's so proud of me, and she called you out as well, Bobby, for having hired us. Bobby, I think, were you involved with PAVE? Was it PAVE back in the day? I think that's around.
PAVE in the S Club.
Yeah, in the S Club. So yeah, I'm speaking of Mental Health America. My first job here in Licking County was at Mental Health America, and Patty was the executive director of that. So she's a very special lady, and she did have to leave early. But I just wanted to call that out. So Bobby, she's also very proud of you. So, we have a couple final questions here. I'm not sure if we're gonna be able to get to both of them. If you're aware, and I'm not sure if anyone, if any of the panel or if anyone in the room is aware, how has recent Ohio legislation affected funding that would potentially be available for Thrive or other gender affirming organizations?
I don't know the answer to that. As far as I know, Thrive would be like insurance based. I don't think, and they're obviously not able to take new clients. So like,
So they did grandfather.
Yeah.
But my son luckily was under that, but they sped up also. We had to make sure that he was going through all his testing for where he was at, with his puberty stuff and stuff like that. And they were able to write into his medical records, that he is starting as of this, but we had to start him on his testosterone just as he hit the edge. Because if not, he wouldn't be able to get it on. And so Thrive was just like in like this mode, calling parents, talking, we're discussing, we're deciding, with our child. And it's extremely stressful.
Yeah.
It's extremely stressful to know that you need these services and this care for your child, and that people are trying to take that away. And then dealing with your own, for me, it's been on a level of like, okay, stay focused, because you're the adult here in the room, but it's happening to you too, but at the same time, your child, it's so important. You gotta focus on what's going on. So Thrive has been, doing everything behind the scenes to keep themselves like.
yeah, there's lots of places that are, working actively to combat this in the way they can. So again, NESW has started training therapists, recognizing when they would have to disclose and making sure they stop and explain to the kid, if you keep talking, I have to disclose your parents. Can we talk about something else? So there are very great people out there resisting this and making sure that in despite of the law, how can we get around the law?
Even the private program relied heavily upon donations from the community.
Yeah.
Scott Lewis was having to go out
Yep.
and drum up funding because the government didn't provide.
Yeah.
So, and now of course the legislation puts it.
Yeah.
Also, many insurance companies don't cover gender affirming care in the first place. That was a big deal when Equitas added that part of insurance.
All right. Finally, what resources are available for families who must leave the state to obtain gender affirming care, such as any assistance with travel or anything? Are you aware of any?
It's all underground right now. It exists though, like find people like those folks over there that really can help you out. Other places that would actually probably be very helpful are the abortion folks in Ohio. They're very well skilled of how to get you out of the state to get what you need. They probably will not be able to fund you, but they're also in those same circles and can connect you with someone. Right now, it's a lot of like, hey, my friend will drive you to Michigan. Like, it's not formalized in any way. There's nowhere to like sign up or call to get this, but there are people willing to drive you to wherever you need to go. And so, yeah, it's underground, but the services exist. I probably shouldn't do it. I would be willing to do it. But there are many people in these very activist spaces that are also like already talking about how will we get trans folks out of Ohio safely if we need to. So like safe houses are already being planned. With abortion, there are people that learned how to do abortion on their own in preparation. There are some really amazing people in Ohio that will not leave Ohio. I am one of those. I think that the way I present is very cis, straight, white woman. So I will leverage that privilege to make sure that my community is safe, even if it means like getting them to Canada. My parents have a vote too, so like, I got you. So yeah, it's underground, but there is very active resistance and they're preparing for worst case scenario already. So if November goes badly and Project 2025 is enacted, we're already preparing for that. Also, if you haven't read Project 2025, you're going to give it a glance because It's terrifying for more than just LGBTQ folks.
So Trans Ohio is an organization and they have a grant that folks can apply to if necessary for travel. I don't think it's a hugely significant amount of money, but it is something. And Trans Ohio also runs legal name change clinic and has grants for that too. So it's not just for getting out of seeking care out of state. And again, I think it's important to just think about inequitable access to care and folks who have the privilege to be able to seek resources out of state versus folks who don't.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much. We are at 12 o'clock, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Thank you so much to our panelists. Let's give them a round of applause. We'll appreciate the knowledge and insight and experience that you shared. And thank you to all of you for coming and engaging in this conversation with us. It is so important. And, you know, we had a very long conversation. We didn't even get to all of our questions. We could obviously spend so much more time on this. So thank you. Yeah, so again, I had, if you remember, United and Pride, our steering committee meets on the third Thursday of every month, which is coming up next week, I believe, Thursday at 6 p.m. And following the steering committee meeting, we will have our Pumpkins and Pride event, so we'll be painting pumpkins. You're welcome to come if you want to join, just so that we know how many people to plan for. You can reach out to me, or you can reach out to Sharon. She is on our board and is our board liaison to United and Pride. David back there.
What time is that?
6:30.
6:30 for the pumpkins. Yeah.
I do want to say that Family Health Services in East Central Ohio is actually sponsoring the event for us.
Yeah.
So we're gonna have pizza and drinks and food. Everyone is welcome. And one of the things that I do want to say is allies, you've got to organize and you've got to get busy. Because you have access to spaces that people in the community do not have access to, and your voice matters.
Take open that door for the folks that can't take in that door. You
Yes,
have to leverage
yes,
your privilege as you have it. That was
You
one of
need
us for the record.
privilege in order to move us forward.
Yeah.
That's really important.
And I, you know, it's easy to forget or not realize or maybe not know because we think we're in an era where equality, but queer people are legally, from a legal standpoint, less free than cis straight people. So just keep that in mind. There are a lot more legal inequities than you would realize. So we literally don't have access to something that everyone else does. So with that, I'm going to stop our recording here. Thank you all again so much for